This is an interview with Jake Cooper, the founder of Railway, a tool to build powerful infrastructure without the pain. During the interview, Jake got a tsunami warning, but carried on without batting an eyelid.
One tool and just apply it wherever. You are in danger. Okay, interesting.
We cover why Railway is working on arguably the hardest problem in DevTools, why they're completely remote, how and why they're building their own data centers, which I think is a first on scaling DevTools, and why a low email open rate led them to completely rethink how they do sales.
I don't know if you ever watched Minority Report. It's like precog sales. Essentially, you're trying to tap into when this person is actually going to want to be helped, right? So that we can potentially project hey, maybe we can be around for you to go and do that, right?
Future can be seen.
Finally, we talk about why Jake thinks you absolutely need to do hard things. Enjoy.
It's funny because I was talking with somebody the other night, and I think my maybe controversial opinion about remote, despite running a remote company, is that I think it's a terrible idea for the vast majority of people. I think it requires a lot. It requires a lot of foresight. It requires a lot of thought. You get a lot of stuff for free just literally being in San Francisco. It's not free. It costs you shitload of rent and obviously all the other things, right? But you get a lot of stuff from just being in person, right? So I don't want to diminish the aspect of being in person. We get everybody together twice a year. We fly people out to, we were just in New Buffalo. I think the next one will be in Portugal. We try to cycle between Western and Eastern hemisphere just so people don't have to travel too much. But yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits to being in San Francisco. I think I personally should be in San Francisco. There's just so many people here in general, whether it's talking with customers or venture capitalists or literally anybody in between, right? There's just so many benefits, right? Awesome founders who you can just chat with, stuff like that. But I think that running a remote company gives you some amount of advantages if you're willing to do the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What would you say are the advantages?
I think you can have people be hyper autonomous from day one, right? So you can hire people who are going to be able to go and drive various things in various different zones. If they're in disparate time zones, it's almost a really, really strong forcing function of how do you build your process in such a way that even if I have minimal amount of time to interact with this person, right? So if I have a director, I have two direct reports in Japan right now. Right.
I saw that
because the org's still flat, right? But the time zone overlap is garbage, right? Actually in Japan's not too bad, but we have one person who's in, Thailand or Australia. And that one's actually super, super hard because it's you have basically 1 hour of overlap, right? And so if the people aren't autonomous, can't drive, et cetera, all of those things, and they're going to essentially be sitting kind of waiting around, it makes it extremely difficult to run a remote company. Right. So there's benefits, which is it kind of forces you to go and skew that kind of general direction. But there's also drawbacks in terms of potential people who you can hire. Right. We haven't figured out a good way to do junior mentorship or internship stuff remotely. Right. Because it's we don't want to be basically discriminatory about where we hire, but at the same time, those new engineers, they need a little bit more kind of touch point interaction. They need maybe a little bit more help and stuff like that, right? And if your time zones don't overlap, then you can potentially have these people kind of drifting in space, waiting essentially, right? As a super lean team remotely working on really hard stuff, that presents a kind of challenge that is very difficult to overcome and that we haven't figured out how to go and do yet. So I don't want to paint a picture that it's all roses or whatever, and that everybody's doing it wrong, because it's just it's chocolate or vanilla. It's different ways to run a company.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. At some point, you're going to land a big customer and they're going to ask you for enterprise features. That's where WorkOS comes in, because they give you these features out the box. Features like skim provisioning, SAML authentication, and audit logs. They have an easy-to-use API, and they're trusted by big dev tools like Vercel, as well as smaller, fast-growing dev tools like Knock. So if you're looking to cross the enterprise chasm and make yourself enterprise ready, check out WorkOS. We've also done an episode with Michael, the founder of WorkOS, where he shares a lot of tips around crossing the enterprise chasm, landing your first enterprise deals, and making sure that you're ready for them. Thanks, WorkOS, for sponsoring the podcast, and back to the show. Yeah, that makes sense. I like the way you put it in one of your blog posts, or I think you said one of your team said that you should hire torpedoes.
Yeah, exactly. That would be Miguel. He works on the proxy. He's basically single-handedly built the proxy and edge network, and removed we used to be on Envoy, And Matt Klein is awesome. But at some point he was basically like, you guys have millions and millions and billions of like these like actual like edge services that are like going to need to be like the XDS protocol is like, at some point it slows down, right? And you're seeing those things. So Miguel built all of that from scratch, but he's talking about a torpedo. It's basically like, it's like, how do you get people to realize that like speed is almost the only thing that matters? And even if you're pointed almost in the wrong direction, if you can get like 5 shots on net, you're at, call it like 178 degrees, right? You're like not completely opposite, right? But like you run 5 iterations of that kind of like loop, essentially, you're mostly going to be on target, right? And so just like continually, just like quickly recalibrate like where you should be in general, and then move towards that, So I think that's the torpedo metaphor that they were talking about.
Yeah, that's really cool. Also, just to like hit on the flat org structure. So there's about 20 people right now you have, right?
Yeah, like 25 people now.
Okay. And so if there's 25, 24 are reporting to you basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does are you like, have you seen apparently Elon Musk has like 1-minute chats with people like back to back, or like are you kind of sat there and like people are coming like?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not that bad at that point because I think like he did that with like all of like Twitter or X when he acquired it. So there's probably like, hundreds of people and like in and out. And like, I think the meme was that like, it was from like Mark Andreessen talking about this, right? Like, he went into to Twitter and just like sat with everybody. So no, it's not that bad yet. I run one-on-ones with people every 2 weeks. We go and sit down for 30 minutes. I have office hours. People can pull me aside. I personally bias for pretty much everything in public. So I have a little, I have a little like channel inside of, so we run the whole company in Discord. I have a little channel inside of Discord called like Cooper Inbox. And so if you want to pull me aside or anything else like that, obviously like my philosophy is that like DMs are private, right? Like they're personal, et cetera. If you have like, you can't make your one-on-one because doctor's appointment, stuff like that, right? And it's important for people to like have a space for that. I think that's something that I switched on earlier. I was like, used to be like, no DMs, like you don't need whatever, right? And I was like, actually, the only thing that matters is that information like flows through the company in the most important way.
You had no DMs at the beginning.
Well, I was philosophically opposed, right? Because I was basically like, well, the optimal way to go and do this is to put everything in public, right? You just share it in public, then everybody has access to it, et cetera. And then I kind of flipped on it and I was basically like, it doesn't matter so long as the information kind of gets there. And my job as a leader should be to like skew people to say like, if I want, everything to go into public, like what are the reasons for which people are using DMs, right? And it's like, okay, well then we can maybe like massage those and move them towards there. But it's kind of like always like it's like an asymptotic goal. It's like, you're never going to have like no DMs or whatever. Right. So I think it's like, it's important to also like, I think as a leader, be able to state when like, you're just wrong. I think that one's important too. Cause people are like, just like, oh shit, like, they make mistakes too. Like I can also make mistakes and that's totally fine, because mistakes are good. It means you're moving fast.
Yeah. The torpedo is adjusting.
Exactly.
It's very interesting. And you were talking about scaling with leverage. You were kind of DMing me this, and was this within this context of like technical, or is this like an org thing?
Yeah, so I would say it's like it's both, if that makes sense, right? So we like, we just brought on our kind of like first salesperson, right? And I think we're in a good spot right now, from a revenue perspective, where things are like growing well, et cetera, and we're like trying to figure out like what does that look like in general, right? And so I think like the standard, operating procedure for a company is like, they hit probably what you call like product market fit, where you're growing like, call it like 2 to 3x year over year, and you're trying to like add more revenue. And so you like go out and you just hire a shitload of like sales reps and go and do this thing and like try and throw bodies at a wall or whatever. And you do the same thing from like a marketing perspective. You do the same thing from an engineering perspective. You just say like, okay, it's really working. And like, we're pulling down this amount of money this month, and we need to be able to operationalize it, right? Like immediately, right? Like where you can just say like, oh, cash flow in, cash flow out, right? And I think the thing that we do that we kind of try and lean more towards is like basically trying to build systems over time that can operationalize that with leverage, right? And saying like, okay, instead of hiring, a ton of like line rep, like support engineers or stuff like that, where we're just like, okay, let's like, we can hire a ton of these people. We can put them all in different time zones. We can, et cetera, like have optimal coverage so that like our metrics like trend towards like time to first resolution of like 0, basically, right? Like getting back to your customers as fast as possible, right? Like we've kind of actually moved in a little bit of a different direction where we've said like, let's hire 3 really, really awesome like support engineers, right? Like full on engineers, right? Like they're not support reps or anything else like that. Like they are building out the internal help station tool that we use for all of our like support comms, right? And so we've like invested on that front essentially, right? So that over time, right? Like when we go to our next factor of scaling, we can say like, hey, we do actually want global coverage, because what the limiting reagent right now is basically whoever's on rotation, they have to sleep at some point, right? So like, how do we figure out how to go and scale that to like go and drive that down, right? And so we try and think about like building leverage every single step of the way so that we can hire really, really excellent people and compensate them well, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of aligns. Angelo, who's amazing on your team, wrote this really cool article about how you were looking at doing sales. And it also, I think Angelo's background is actually maybe interesting as well, just to briefly say that he said he was like,
Yeah.
started out as an SRE and then moved to software engineer, product manager, now doing sales. So like, just like does, and still writes code, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah, he still does, right? So we have a lot of like multifaceted people, right? Angel's definitely one of them, where people are just like, I want to come here, I want to do excellent work. You know, I don't want you to put me in a box. I don't want you to like go and do all of these other standard kind of things, et cetera. While also having the understanding that like that leverage and that compounding comes from actually like building in a space, right? And so I think Angela's chosen kind of like the sales support solutions kind of area to like make their own and really, really go deep on that, right? So yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think what he was saying, and you can correct me on this, but from the article was that you were looking at like sales, learning sales, following the playbook, and you were like, none of this is going to work. Learning to play golf is not going to work. You were looking at the email reply rates were like 0.3% or something for like even your existing customers, whereas like outbound cold emails from your recruiter was like 0.5, and you were like, this is just not going to work. So I guess the non-scale answer would have been just hire loads of salespeople to send a lot more emails, but then you had quite a unique approach that maybe you can share a little bit about what you built.
Yeah, I mean, so we basically like, you know, we noticed this, and then Angelo was the first to pull it out because he was like, I think he pulled Ian, our you know, the talent lead aside, and he was like, hey, dude, you know, I'm getting, for lack of a better word, my ass beat on these emails. I send so many of them out, and like nothing comes back, right? Like nobody responds, right? Like how do you craft a really, really good cold email, right? And I think he got some tips, and he got a little bit more kind of like leverage out of it, but it was still like not very good, right? And so I looked at this, and I was like, you know, I'm an engineer by trade. Like, why would I ever respond to this like email? Like, what's the bonus, or what's the boon, or like what's the reason that I would actually go and do this, right? And like, just as a more like philosophical question, not even like in the current context, it's like, why would I respond to this email, right? And the reason I would respond to this email is like, if this person was giving me something that I want, right? Either like, you know, in a kind of like more predatory way, like the feature is gated, right? And I want to unlock that feature and go and do those things, right? And so that's why, you know, some people will respond to like traditional sales emails, right? And saying like, I need this quota, or I need this thing, or whatever, right? But what's the like best possible experience that we think that we could offer to somebody, right? It's like they get to a point where, you know, either they need some like reassurance because they're like, hey, you know, like I'm scaling on the platform, I want to talk to somebody, you know, like at some point you do want to actually like know who's behind your kind of like infrastructure so that you can be like, oh, these people are trustworthy, et cetera. So that's one reason, right? If you have a technical problem that you're like looking to go in and solve, that's another reason, et cetera, right? So like, at what points are people actually going to like want to talk to people? And at what points, which is the vast majority of points, will they have absolutely no interest in talking to anybody on like the sales solutions, et cetera, kind of side, right? And so what we've done internally is we've, you know, we keep segment events for like every single interaction that happens. Like we don't track like users from like a cookie perspective, or like we don't have any front end tracking or anything else like that. But we do emit when people get to get to green, right? So their first deploy or anything else like that, right? And so we can actually try and figure out like, you know, and this is like a lot of trial and error, like when do people actually respond to outreach and where do they respond to it at most, right? And it ends up being that like, if you can meet the user where they are, right, and say like, hey, you've already got some stuff like spun up, you're getting to a point where you're starting to create tickets, right? We have all of that information, and we can add new segment events because we run our own help station, right? Like you made a couple questions and stuff like that. Maybe it's a good time for sales to get involved, right? And say like, hey, what are you actually trying to build here, right? Like, how do we get this inside your organization, right? Like, maybe you've shadow ops IT'd it in here, and your VP of engineering has no idea that this tool exists, right? Like, what are the kind of like blockers that we would need to like overcome to potentially move that through into the organization, right? And over the years, we've kind of like done that. And over the years, we've kind of removed the objections. And over the years, we've gotten a little bit better at kind of like doing the like product led growth with also the like sales kind of like assist motion, you know?
Yeah, it's really smart, honestly, because I think you illustrated it really well in the article where it was like, there's times where the salespeople are just so annoying, and then there's times when they're all caps emailing you like, "What's going on?" Like, why, or like, "How do I fix this thing?" And it's like that fight, but you don't want them to email you at that point. You want them to kind of you're trying to anticipate when maybe that kind of point is going to happen.
Yeah, I think Angelo's used the term like I don't know if you ever like watched Minority Report. It's like precog sales. Essentially, you're trying to like tap into like when this person is actually going to like want to be helped, right? So that we can potentially project like, hey, maybe we can be around for you to go and do that, right? And it helps if your time to resolution is really quick. You have people in disparate time zones that can help on this, right? You have multiple people like rolling through this rotation, et cetera, right? So there's a variety of different things, but like at the end of the day, it comes down to basically, how do you meet the user where they are, when they're ready to like basically say like, please, somebody help me, like I have a problem, or like whatever, I need this thing, right? And you're like, excellent, we can do that, right? But the worst possible thing is like you send sales cold outbound with no like personalization or anything else like that. And then when the user says like, hey, my queries are slow now, right? It's like crickets for like 24 hours, right? And admittedly, there was a period where we were just not doing support very well, right? Where our time to resolution was like, it was in the like 12 hours, the like, pushing on to like, 24 hours, right? And since like then we've like over the last year, we've basically just drilled that all the way down, right? And so now we're getting back to people like way, way quicker. We're rolling out like ways for like people to be able to like page us. We've had that from like a enterprise level, but like, how do you actually determine, severity of impact on like the support side, right? Like these are just like engineering problems, right? And that's why like we hire support engineers, we hire go-to-market engineers, we hire, obviously product engineers and platform engineers, right? But like we want to build out these solutions with leverage so that we can actually kind of like scale them over time really, really well without having to just like continually add people to kind of like almost like backfill and hold this whole thing up, right?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's still quite hard to imagine with like such a small team how you're able to kind of actually have like such a quick support function. Is there any? I guess you've got a lot of kind of like you're trying to resolve their problems preemptively, and you're trying to have like really good discovery in terms of like help center and stuff like that. Was there anything else that you did to kind of reduce the time?
Yeah. So I think there's a like one of our like support engineers has this really, really awesome quote that I think he's put into a blog post, but that I like, steal all the time now. Essentially support is the catch of like the try catch, right? Like users try documentation, they try to figure it out on their own, they try to whatever, right? And then when nothing is working and they can't figure it out on their own, they like essentially they throw up that exception and they say like, help, and so support essentially is designed to almost like, I think people like look at it potentially in a myopic view. It's like, well, there are tickets. How do I go in and handle them? Right. And then you just like focus on like ticket resolution, all those other things. But like, if you think about it a little bit more holistically, there's all of that other stuff that like leads up in front of support, right? It's like, is your documentation clear? Like, are your deployments like are going green, right? Like we've built our own kind of like internal build and deploy system to like statically analyze code. And then we take some of the outputs and figure out like, hey, this was a Django app. It didn't get off the ground. Why did it not get off the ground? Is it something we can go and fix in any of these like Nix package providers to go and make this better, right? All of these things sit in front of support, right? So support is not just like, I have a ticket and I want a resolution. It's actually like, I have a problem and I want a solution, right? Which like expands the scope for which you can operate in, right? And that like goes all the way up to our community. We have like awesome people in our community who've like built stuff out. We've incentivized them. With swag and credits and all these other things, right? And so we like go in and push people to basically say like, hey, if you have an issue, in all likelihood, somebody else also has the issue, right? Like how many times have you just gone to Stack Overflow or GitHub or anything else like that and be like, oh, this is literally my issue, right? And so like we're building a corpus over on the like help.railway.com site of all of these kind of issues. And so those users can like run into that issue, figure out it's an issue. Either it's a platform issue and it has to get bubbled up to us, at which point we can like, we built the whole systems. We can attach a linear ticket to it. We can go and push it through triage. We can go resolve it, and that whole life cycle is all automated. So whenever the ticket goes to in progress, the user will be notified. Whenever it goes to resolved, they'll also be notified.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and then so then you can just like group and aggregate these things, right? And again, those are only things that we can go and do because we get built out our support experience so that we have the ultimate control to basically say like, how do we build the ultimate amount of leverage?
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And it kind of actually makes me puts me onto a question I kind of wanted to ask you, because I feel like you're actually addressing like the hardest problem in DevTools building Railway. Is like I heard you on the DevTools FM podcast talking, which is really good. Talking about how you're like, why someone's asking you why are you building Railway, and your answer was like, why wouldn't I? This is like the hardest problem, and probably the biggest limitation for most people that want to build stuff is I've had it myself, where like I wanted to build something for the first time that was a lot more complex than just like something I could build with like a classic kind of like Next.js, whatever. And suddenly you want to deploy this really complex thing that like process videos in my case, and suddenly you have to spend so much time on infrastructure, which is really hard. And it's kind of solved with AWS in the sense of like you can do it. It's like you could build your whole stack on AWS, but it's very, very complicated. And what I think is so hard is that you've got this challenge where you've got to be able to do everything that you do on AWS, but it's got to be like significantly more simple that to do than with AWS. I would feel like is your challenge, which I've spoken to a few startups that are doing this, and I always think this is the hardest problem to be solving. So my question is like, how are you? yeah. So there was a question in there, which was just like, I guess like, how do you think about that kind of like the complexity and the simplicity, like the power and the simplicity?
Yeah. So I think like my view on this has changed a little bit over time, but it's like mostly just kind of like shifted a bit, right? And I think there's a couple, like we've been talking about like design principles internally at Railway and like what are design principles, right? And I think one of them that like, I've really, really liked is like almost expose. So the principle, if I had to put it into words, would be like expose complexity as depth incrementally. It's kind of wordy, and we'll work on that. But essentially what it means is that like the user should always, right? So if you talk about like Donald Norman's like design principles, right? Like visibility, feedback, and mapping, right? And so mapping is really, really important. It's basically like, where does the user kind of like map this in their brain? When you think about the complexity, it's essentially like when you're designing a feature, you should really know where your user is almost going like next, right? It's like, if I am in the current user lifecycle, what am I trying to go in and do, right? Like, and where should that kind of like feature or toggle or anything else like that exist in the kind of like visual space, right? And that's why like we've like invested really, really heavily in the canvas, right? Because we're basically saying like, hey, we want to make it really easy for you to only kind of like think about the things that you really want to think about right now, and the other stuff can be removed. You can kind of like know where it is like vaguely in space in like kind of like an Age of Empires like fog of war type thing, right? But like,
I was just that's literally just what I was thinking about, like that kind of like Age of Empires where you get dropped in and you've just got one little village. Yep. You got the town center and nothing else.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I'm reasonably, I would say big gamer. And so like the two that I pull from like gaming is like, it's either Factorio for infrastructure, or it's like, the Age of Empires, kind of like Fog of War or anything else like that. But yeah, essentially like, how do you figure out ways to like give your user the next step and only the next step, right? And so a second principle that I really, really like is like, make the user make no choices, right? And so I think like people kind of mess this up generally when they kind of like say like, hey, here's a modal and like, here's two options, right? You have to make a choice, right? Like, and my thing about this is like, people think that there's like two options and you can like look at conversion and stuff like that, right? But you have to also look at the fall off in the funnel. And when you give a user two options, they're going to pick a third option, which is close the tab, right? Even if you give a user one choice and say like, okay, cool, right? Like we have our terms of service, right? We have 98.6% conversion from like terms of service to like sign up. And the terms of service is literally like, it's like it just goes through like there's no actions that you have to do. You literally hit a button, the big button at the bottom of the page, and you still get 1% drop off in that funnel, right? And so if you make the user make choices, you're going to overload them with complexity, right? Like, and so that's what we think about is like, don't make the user make any choices, and like whatever the next possible hop is in that user journey, make it as close as possible so that the user can actually say like, oh, that's where I was going, right? Like it's so easy. It's like really like, and then you draw like a very, very thin line for them to say like, that's the thing, right? Like here's the button, right? Because in an ideal world, that's the best possible experience is you hit a button, you get the resolution, right? You hit a button, you get the resolution, right? I think this is something that like, AI for all its hype or whatever is like, what the next possible step is. It's like you move to natural language and you say that was wrong, right? And like getting more accurate over time is a thing that like will happen with AI, but there's a very tractable next step, which is like you see the thing and you know where to go.
Have you got any examples of either things that you see other startups like getting you to choose between, or things that you were getting people to choose between initially, and you kind of now it's like there is no choice, just to kind of illustrate?
Yeah. So I would say that like, I think something that other people potentially make mistakes on is like, okay, let's do provisioning as an example, right? You're trying to provision a service, right? I know based on your repository, like, so I could do two things up front, right? I could do the easy thing for me, which is basically say like, tell me that this is like a Docker file and that it exists here, and like, or otherwise, tell somebody to select like a build pack, like a cloud native build pack or whatever, or anything else like that. That's like the easy thing to build. Like the UI is like pretty easy or whatever, right? But it requires the user make a choice. It requires the user understand what a Docker file is. It requires the user understand what a build pack is. And that's one step, right? Like this is why the AWS like configuration thing is like kind of a mess. Is like you go through it and you're like, okay, I'll select, my name. Okay, cool. That's good. That's not really a choice. Like it's fine. And then you move on to the next thing. And it's like, do you want Ubuntu, Debian, like a bunch of other operating systems or stuff like that? And you're like, what the fuck? Like, what am I doing here? Like, I have no idea. And then you close the tab to like go and figure out something else. And then maybe you never come back, right? And so that's the attrition in that funnel, right? And so if you can actually do all of the hard work to basically like statically analyze the code and stuff like that and be like, this is probably this, right? This is a probable outcome or whatever, right? And then, maybe not even make the user make any sort of decision, just say like, that was the thing, right? And then kind of like usher them forward by saying like, hey, we weren't able to build your thing, right? Like we statically analyzed it. We look for any of the stuff, et cetera, right? And then try and figure out where they're trying to go next, right? Like, and then, build that into your experience and say, oh, actually looks like, we have a higher percentage of like failures when it comes to like a monorepo. Maybe like our monorepo detection needs like work for stuff like this because people are trying to like, push a front end and a back end into here, and they don't know that they've got to like, kind of select into the like front end folder, right? And set a root directory. It's like, okay, well, like how do you move those things a little bit more forward so that the user doesn't really need to like make decisions to say like, give me your root directory. They just say like, I want to deploy my repository and like it is my front end, right? Perfect. You move that forward.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think like that's kind of was like the magic with like First Cell was like you just do it and it just works, and it's like you don't even have to make any selections around it. So it's like it's like you're bringing that kind of experience to like much more complicated like infrastructure setups kind of thing, where it's like you're guessing or not guessing, you're like kind of figuring out what they probably need and doing that for them. And then they can back out of that later if it's not the thing they want, and like displaying more.
Yeah. And hopefully you can give people things that like are almost like double duty, so like they solve multiple problems, right? And so like an issue with like, call it like monorepo deployment or like microservices or stuff like that is basically like, what is the ordering of my service, right? Like I think Lyft had a PR open on Kubernetes for like years where they were just like, we need like ordering or anything else like that, right? And they're like, no. I don't know if I think that might be the PR, but anyways, you need ordering and stuff like that. And many people will integrate like Bazel or like custom workflows or anything else like this to go and make this happen. And so, well, how do we like derive like ordering, right? Like as just an implicit thing, right? It's like, well, okay, like we need an ability to like kind of like store variables, right? And so like we know to know what your like backend URL is, right? And so if we build a system that allows you to like drag pieces on the canvas to say, this is my backend and it needs to consume this variable on this database, then inherently like this service depends on this service, right? And so this service should roll out before this other service, right? And so you can construct that like DAG. And that's like a feature we rolled out recently, but it's like, if you're already using these features, you can just like get compounded benefits, right? And I think that like, as you figure out ways to like go in and compress that experience to say, if you use a couple of these primitives, you get all of these outputs, right? Then like you can incrementally adopt those things. that's what ends up moving people towards like, oh, this feels like magic, right? Like that's awesome, right?
Yeah.
It's like magic, and people are like, oh, what is magic? Like, how do you right? Like magic is just doing less shit than you thought you would have to go and do, right? Like that's it. That's the only thing that like quantifies magic, right? It's like, oh wow, like it already works. That's awesome, right? Like it feels like magic, right? And so if you can figure out ways to just have the user do less and get more, like your product will feel more magical, right? Like a lot of the kind of trend of like moving stuff onto your landing page and like allowing people to access your product, right? Is like, that's magic, right? Because you're just like, oh, normally I have to sign up, normally I have to like whatever, do all of these other things, right? Like, so you can just think about like, if you think about that compression, then a lot of like magical experiences just open up to you,
Yeah, that's really cool. We're defining magic. I love it. Yeah. And okay, so one question I've got, which is actually, I don't know if I cut that part, but Paul Butler, in case we did, Paul Butler is a customer of yours, a fellow Canadian, and a great guy running Drifting in Space. And he was he wanted me to ask you about your dedicated servers, your bare metal servers that you're now operating. Which it's not in the usual DevTools playbook of like open your own data center.
No, it's not. Yeah. And so like, I mean, we've got 2 DCs online, a third one coming in over the next like month. And then like Singapore should be online in January, right? So we'll have like 4 data centers in, basically 4 different regions. And we'll have global coverage of like, less than 100 milliseconds, like door to door for literally anybody in the world, which is super cool. And I would say it's like going pretty well. I think we've got a blog post that we're working on right now. It's basically like, how do you go from 0 to like running your own hyperscaler in like 6 months? And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. And so like, there's a lot of interesting stuff when it comes to running a data center, right? There's obviously like the procurement of servers, like how do you buy them? Like what do you spec? Like what are people interested in? And then there's like, okay, well, like how do you find a space for these things, right?
Yeah.
Like you basically have to like find a building, right? And so you have to like go to Equinix or Digital Realty and like compare all of these things, right? And then like you have to kind of like almost take this transparency paper of like who's providing which services, like internet services at which rate to like these other companies. And then because like we want to move to like a point where we're doing like really, really cool, like, zero downtime stateful failover, like interactions with like any perceptible latency, any perceptible issues or anything else like that. Like we're taking another transparency paper and we're saying like, where are dark fiber lines that we can actually like go in and tap into so that we can go and do like terabit or like terabyte plus transfer rates, right? To like make sure that we can say like, if a tsunami hits like this data center, like you're totally fine. Like there's no issues or anything else like that. Right. And that provides a variety of benefits, right? Whether it's like image transfer sizes or anything else like that. And we've hooked it into our orchestrator so that, and I think like this is the thing that's like really interesting is like ultimately the only thing that matters is that like your compute is close to your storage, right? Like, it's like that's what matters because like your database queries, right? If you have to go speed of light between these data centers, it takes way longer, right? So storage ended up being a really interesting problem that we've like, I would say solved on the cloud stuff, and we're now solving on the kind of like bare metal stuff.
Wow, yeah, that is extremely interesting. And so who like that seems like multiple people's like full-time job, but we've already established you're doing a lot with like 25 people.
Yeah.
How the heck have you managed that?
So that is basically, I would say right now, probably it was 2 people's full-time job. Our head of operations, Christian, and one of our most seasoned kind of infrastructure people, Charth. And so they've been kind of like mostly building this out. We're getting more people involved. The person who built our orchestrator, Pierre, person who built our proxy, Miguel. And yeah, that's another awesome person that we've brought on named Finn, who's like the best, like one of the best networking people I've ever like met. And so, we're pulling in more people to go in and build this stuff out, right? But it's still like one singular person basically like driving these DCs, right? So there's a lot of different stuff that goes into it. But yeah, it's been cool because we've continued to operate with leverage and say like, like philosophically, how do we attract really, really excellent talent, right? It's like, well, we give them really, really interesting problems. We, give them the capacity to like push these forward and like give them the space where they can build the best, like do the best work of their life, right? For the lack of a better word, right? So yeah, it's close to like one-ish person doing these things, right? And there's a lot of stuff that gets involved, right?
What kind of stuff have you learned about running data centers?
I mean, it's like hardware procurement is like the difficult thing is like actually almost like procuring the hardware, if that makes sense, right? Like I've learned that like first of all, a lot of the systems on that side of the house are just like super super archaic, right? Like if you want people to like go in and rack your stuff, it's like you send them like an Excel sheet or a PDF of like here's how like you go in and wire these things together, basically, right? And so you have to like punch in this format. Basically, it's like you're doing punch cards essentially, where you're just like, here, put these like servers here, and then put these cables here, and then plug in these like fiber lines here, and then like put this like spine here, essentially, right? And we're like, wow, that's like a lot of paperwork that we like don't want to go in and do. And so Pierre has built this thing where it's like we've essentially kind of like virtualized the racks, because we're like, well, we need to know where these things are anyways, so that we can kind of like say the storage needs to be close to the compute. So we'll keep all your stuff together so that your everything is super fast. We've like virtualized those racks. So it's like, well, like what if we just had like an output thing where you could just like add more stuff to this like virtual rack, and then just say like, here's the diff, go in and like send it to these people, right? And so kind of taking that archaic format and like moving it a little bit more forward, so that we're getting just like almost get to a point where it's like, how do we copy paste data centers, right? So that's like one thing that we've learned that's I think super neat.
That's I feel like if someone's looking for startup ideas, they should just go and talk to Railway and see what they've built internally.
Yeah, I mean the whole space over there is like, and I think there's a little bit of arb in terms of like stepping into just hard things, because people are like, oh my god, that's so hard, it's like really impossible to like go in and do that, right? And you just like go and look at it and you're like, wow, there's so much low hanging fruit. Like, yes, of course, like a lot of these things are hard, right? But it's like, oh my god, like a lot of this is like a kind of a bit of a shit show. How do we like go in and refine a bit of this process to make it kind of less of a mess, right? Because it's hard, because it's like esoteric and difficult to navigate, and like there's problems that like pop up and stuff like that over time, right? But if you just keep solving those hard problems, right, like you get to a point where you're actually like, oh, okay, cool, you can just do things, the meme or whatever.
Yeah, I believe it about you guys. That's very cool. Okay, so I guess is it like, I guess you see yourself as like taking on AWS at some point eventually, like it's like to that scale where you're going to build out this global scale of like of like hardware, and then be able to do anything and be able to just like run completely off AWS.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an interesting question, right? So like, I guess like at the heat death of the universe, everything is competitive with everything else. And so like at some point we'll be competing with AWS, right? But like they're so gigantic and they've built like so many cool, awesome, excellent things, right? That like we actually work with like companies on AWS, right? We work with companies on GCP. We work with like companies like wherever, right? So we're not dogmatic about like where we want to run this, right? Like again, we've built our own orchestrator, so you can just like curl the binary into a box, pair into the WireGuard network, right? Just like bada bing, it works, right? But like we want to make sure that we can offer the user the best possible experience, right? And for us, like there's only so much stuff you can go and do in the cloud, right? And so like, we've built like some in-house like storage stuff that's allowing us to at this point like start to roll out like copy on write pull request environments, right? So like we already currently do like your full infrastructure is like a preview, right? But like, the database is empty or whatever, right? And some people are like, oh, how do I like seed this with like data that I can actually use and stuff like that, right? And so now we can actually give you like full copy on write production environments. But if you make any changes, then like they just kind of exist in this parallel universe. You can test against your staging data, et cetera, right? But you're not going to break anything for anybody else. Then you can merge, we'll go and clean all those things up. That's only possible because we have our own DCs and we've like built all of those things, right? Like being able to do like really, really fast image transfers. So you get like instantaneous like builds, right? Like you can do it on cloud, right? If you like get really, really good about like data proximity and all of those other things, right? And like, you can build your stuff beside where it's going to go and have to run. But you can also just like take advantage of like, 100 gig lines that you happen to run between these DCs, or like like terabit lines that, right? Like that you run between these DCs or stuff like that, right? So like it allows you to unlock this kind of additional layer, right? And so, I mean, AWS is huge. There's so many other companies as well, right? Like we just want to give people the best possible experience.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Honestly, it's super cool, and there's so much opportunity, I think, to do it and to do it well.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think AWS's revenue, someone told me, was like the quarterly revenue was like 500 billion last quarter. That
I think
sounded
it's
insane.
yeah.
Is that true? Is it
I think it's in
500?
the hundred-ish hundreds,
Yeah,
it's ginormous, right? Like, I mean,
yeah.
I I think if we go back to like the kind of like start of the interview and you're saying like, oh, this is hard and this is kind of like the problem to solve. It's like I think that this is the problem to solve, right? Like just from like it's complicated. People really, really want to work on it. Like people need
Yeah.
it from like an ability to move forward perspective. The market is absolutely gigantic, right? And so there's a massive amount of like leverage to be had here, right? Like I think that like if we do this right, like there's almost this kind of like kink toes right now, which is like, how do I go from like idea to like thing that is running that everybody can go and
Mm,
access, right? And if we do our job right, we kind of unkink that hose, right? And a massive, massive amount of kind of like call it GDP, right? If you want to use like Stripe terms or whatever for the internet, just kind of like is unlocked.
yeah, because you're just gonna enable all these people that were tied up with, running Kubernetes, can
Yeah.
suddenly just go back to shipping features and shipping stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And like org level initiatives to like make developers faster by like, buying things like, I don't know, like Spacelift to go and manage their Terraform and CubeStack or anything else like that.
Mm,
Right. Like there's this massive, massive machine of like, how do I go from idea to production? And in most organizations, it's kind of like, you use that leverage quote. It's kind of almost like held up by like all of these like DevOps
yeah,
SRE people, like literally just doing God's work to just like go in and just make sure all of this stuff
it's
just
hard
like
work.
stays up. It's so hard. It's so difficult, right? And they built really awesome tools. Like, I think that like, I'll rag on Kubernetes because I think like it's kind of a lot of complexity and stuff like that. But like it's a good tool. Like it works and it solves the problems that they need. Right. I just think that like if we can take a bunch of these like verticalized industries that people have done, like
Mm,
Terraform and Cube and Ansible and all those other things, and you can kind of like merge them together, you can get a lot of outsized benefits, right? Even especially if you start to like look at things like observability, like Datadog, right? If you start to look at like things like CDNs, like Cloudflare, right? You start consolidating a lot of these things. It would be really, really great if you could just learn one tool and just apply it wherever.
yeah, yeah. You're not on call.
No, I think that was like a Amber Alert or
Okay.
something.
Okay.
A tsunami warning. So topical. Hopefully
Wait,
our DC
where are you?
in the I'm in San
Oh,
Francisco. Um,
wait, where's the tsunami then?
I don't know. Let's see. You are in danger. Oh, okay, interesting. Well, I think this will be fine. I'm a
You
very
sure?
laissez-faire person. It's like I'm sure it'll be fine.
Okay.
So yeah,
Okay. Well.
yeah.
Okay.
If there's a wave that
but-
crashes through, I'll
yeah.
be like, oh, sorry, I gotta go. But I'm on the third floor right now, so presumably I'll see water rolling around at the like Geary Road, and I'll be like, oh, I really
Yeah.
have to go. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me. But
we got your lessons on what you've learned about data centers.
yeah, exactly,
so it's
right?
okay.
Like
you can go.
here you go,
now.
take the paper, like carry on the dream. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, because I'd done a lot of like mobile app stuff, and then that kind of led me to doing like lots of like Firebase, and I kind of like gradually got more and more now where I'm actually like touching more like what is properly infrastructure. And it's really amazing how long I think I was like coding without really having to do all this stuff. And it's kind of shocking, like once you leave that kind of like happy path of like you can just build a CRUD app or whatever. Like once you leave that happy path, like how it is surprising how much of a gap in like complexity you suddenly get. It's like a chasm. Suddenly
Yes.
you leave that path and it's just a chasm.
Yeah. There's a massive, massive chasm there, right? I call it kind of the DevOps trough of sorrow, because like you have to kind of move through this chasm of like figuring out what servers are, figuring out what a reverse proxy is, figuring out what is a proxy versus a reverse proxy, right? Like you have to figure out all of this, right? And then you like go and essentially like apply it. You go and mess it up. You go and figure out like ways to go and build these workflows, right? Like in such a way where like you're like, okay, they work for me, right? And then you go like bring people on your team and you're like, wow, that doesn't work anymore, right? Like I guess I need different workflows and I need to replumb everything, right? And then you have this kind of like, n squared complexity of like, I have all these microservices and I have all these environments now. And I have all these like, all this stuff I got to like plumb together. Right. And it pretty rapidly becomes like a full-time job, which is why like it gets consolidated into those areas where you just like don't run into them until you really do. And then you're like, oh, I've like stepped almost like off this cliff into this like amount of stuff that I have to like go and pick up. Right. And so, that was kind of like one of the main things where I was like, okay, like something has to exist here, right? Because you have this almost like happy path, joie de vivre, et cetera, over here, where you're like, I'm building my nice like React app and like everything works or whatever, right? And then you're like, what do I do when I want to go host a backend? And then they're like, go see that guy down the street. And it feels like you're walking down like a seedy alley, and you're like, what am I doing? Here, right? Like,
So Craig's
so like it was just one of those things where it's like you need something here, right? Like something has to exist, right? There needs to be like a lamp post and a light over here, right? So we're building that.
Yeah, that's super cool. So just before we wrap up, last couple questions. So the first one is, if you had like one kind of big takeaway for other DevTools founders, what would it be? If it was like the tsunami's hitting and you're just like, the water's rising, and you've got one message for the DevTools founders.
Just do harder things. Like hard things are almost like, I think there's like a Sam Altman quote, which is basically like risk is not as risk adjusted as like you think, basically, right? And so like more risk is actually like less risky, especially early on, right? Like do harder things, right? Like harder things are not actually as hard as you think that they are, right? Especially when you get really, really good at like paring down complexity, right? And I don't want to diminish any of the stuff that we're doing. There's a lot of stuff that we're doing that's really really difficult, right? But the nice thing is that when you have these difficult problems and you have these like audacious goals or anything else like that, turns out like people like working on hard problems. They like working on interesting things, right? Like it's actually so much easier to like get people who are interested in like really core, dev tools, et cetera, things than like, I don't disparage any company, but like, DocuSign, right? Like some sort of like, how do we send forms or anything else like that, right? Like it's not that interesting, right? But if you have all of these hard problems, obviously you have to go and find the people who have the capacity and desire, along with that desire to like go and do those things, right? But, you can attract really, really awesome people to help you go in and build your vision, right? And so if you're like, oh my God, it's so hard, like how could I go and do it alone? Like, first of all, there's always a clear path to like getting some really, really garbage version of the thing off the ground, right? Like first version of Railway that like I showed to people was like, you can get a Postgres version like instantly, right? And do you know why it was instant? Because it was the same Postgres version. It was like, I just created new users for people. They would hit a button and it would create a user and give you a password, right? And like, that was it, right? But people were like, oh, I really want this, right? Because like,
it's so fast.
It's so fast. Like there's no provisioning. I can just like connect to it or whatever, right? And then you end up with all of these like problems of like, you got serverless things connecting and like flooding your database and all these other things, right? You're like, okay, well, I actually have to solve all of these problems, right? But doing that hard thing quickly and then figuring out if like there's actually a market for it, right? Like I would say is the main thing. Is like find your 80-20, find your fast possible thing, figure out how to like get your first 100 people in like a Discord, right? And like build something there. And then try and figure out how to like make your first dollar, right? And that's like, I think the way to like cut and like do the harder things is like just get really, really core to the thing that you're trying to go in and do, but like also really lean into those hard things, right?
Yeah, that's a really good lesson, I think. And the other one I wanted to ask you is if you have any dev tools that you're using right now that you're really excited about.
I mean,
you can't say cursor.
Yeah, well, I mean, the confident answer was going to be Claude, because I think Claude is just really like it's good. There's a guy on Twitter that I follow. His name is Nick, and I think he worked at OpenAI or anything like that. But he was basically saying like, we're talking about AGI. People are talking about AGI and what it looks like, and it seems to more look like I just talk with my friend like Claude like 11 times a day. I'm like, oh, that's like so right. It's like this thing is like here and it like works. DevTools wise that I think that are solid. I actually quite like Spacelift as like a tool in general. I think that they're really good. And so if you're in like the DevOps SRE space, I think they're great, and you have to manage those kube clusters.
It's like what Terraform we do is generation Spacelift.
Well, it's not like Terraform generation. It's essentially like manages the application lifecycle, right? So like Terraform, you apply it locally or anything else like that. Kind of not a great idea because like, you need production permissions to like go and destroy these things. You got to manage IAM permissions, all this other stuff, right? So if you have like, something you want to consolidate into a bastion somewhere or anything else like that like runs essentially on PR environments or like on merge or anything else like that, like this tool works quite well. It's again, like a bit complicated, but like we dog food like state of the art stuff internally. Like we have a kube cluster and we like have all of these, we've used service meshes in the past and like all this other stuff, right? So we dog food some of our stuff just to host like our web app. And so like this is a tool that like actually is like, okay, this is pretty nice. That actually works, and does the thing, right? It's a bit of a pain in the ass to set up. You have to write like policies if you want to do anything complicated, right? So like you're writing Rego. But again, Claude is actually really good at writing Rego, so you can just do that.
Yeah, that's it's funny how it just unlocks all these languages. I
Yep.
work with FFmpeg quite a lot, and it's just like so good at writing FFmpeg, and it's just
Yeah.
suddenly it's not a barrier.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because it's really, really good at compressing all of that knowledge together, right? And like, yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. I was talking with somebody about, because I mean, I live in SF, so like, there's only two topics of conversation. It's where do you work and what do you think about AI or whatever. And so like, I was talking with somebody the other day, and it was like, I think you're always going to have like a human in the loop, because like by definition, the AI like is kind of like a fuzzy search, right? And so it'll always be 99, 99.9, et cetera, kind of thing, right? So I'm actually pretty bullish on those like human in the loop kind of experiences, right? Like Copilot, et cetera, right? But like at the moment you get to like AI for some random esoteric thing here that's going to like go and solve your stuff, I'm just like, there's no way, right? Like it's always going to have like an issue or anything else like that. You need the person in there. So it's leverage, it's compression, it's all of those like lovely things, you know?
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, I think we're at time, Jake. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, that was great. Likewise.
And people can, I was going to say, people can go to railway.com to see more.
Indeed. Yep. Just launched our new .com recently, so that's excellent. We're now at railway.com. So check us out. And
what is your Twitter handle if anyone wants to follow you?
My Twitter handle is just Jake. So like the word just and then Jake, if you want to go and have a look at that.
That's pretty good as well.
Yeah. That's not bad.
Yeah. Amazing. Thanks, Jake. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much. Cheers.